Coming up, we have The Ship, a pub with a riverside location and not much else going for it. The Alma, which has unfortunately gone a bit gastro, but still has some remnants of a time when we as a civilization were still able to design nice things. The Ram Inn, a one-time alehouse of the 16th century which became the oldest continually brewing site in Britain. Sambrook's Brewery Tap, a bar keeping that brewing tradition alive, and unlike the previous three pubs, somewhere I actually had some decent real ale. The Spread Eagle with its magnificent late Victorian pub interior, let's brush over the beer offering there. And finally, the Cat's Back, a backstreet boozer owned by my favourite brewery, Harvey's of Sussex, so that's at least two pubs where I actually had some beer that I liked. Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in Wandsworth today in southwest London. It's a part of the city that is very much associated with beer and with brewing. I found a newspaper record of 1771 that a man here in Wandsworth undertook a bet to drink a butt of porter in the space of 14 days. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that a butt equates to 108 imperial gallons. That is 864 pints of beer, somewhere in the region of 61 and a bit pints of beer a day. Pub number one, The Ship. Cheers from The Ship. I think I'll do the rest of the audio at home. This is terrible background music here. Just quickly to say, it's a Young's pub. I'm having a half of Young's London Original. Price down there. I almost regret including The Ship on this itinerary. I don't think there is really a lot of historic interest here, and it's a Young's pub, so from my point of view the beer lineup's not particularly interesting either, but it is a bit of a landmark in Wandsworth. It is a draw to lots of people, particularly sort of bright young things, young trendy people, because of all this outside space and the fact that it's overlooking the river, and riverfront pubs are actually a bit of a rarity in Wandsworth. Quick look at the exterior first. It's a three-storey building, painted brick with some light rendering in places. The upper floors gradually get smaller as you go up, and I suppose looking at it you can get a little bit of a ship-like appearance from it, or maybe I'm trying too hard here. I guess it's a 19th century building, but I'm not exactly sure where in the 19th century it falls. The ground floor projects slightly and is formed of a series of arches housing both the windows and the entrances. And there's this large patio area overlooking the river, and that's almost certainly the main appeal of the pub for most people. Inside, I doubt there's much of any significant age remaining here. The bar counter on the side of the pub furthest from the river is at least a hefty piece of wood, albeit rather pale coloured. I'm not sure if that's an original fitting here, and get the sense it might possibly have been transplanted from elsewhere at some point. It has curved corners, fielded panelling, some nice carved brackets supporting the countertop, and some stout wood columns holding up the gantry. There's some matchboard panelling around the walls in this part of the pub in a similar coloured wood. There's a surprising lack of nautical knickknacks on the walls, which you might expect given its riverside location and the fact that it's called The Ship, but perhaps that was just assumed to be too much of a cliche. Quite a lot of the rest of the interior is airy and bright and modern and not particularly pubby, to be honest, and perhaps that suits the clientele. I get the sense this place is popular with bright young things from over the river in Chelsea and Fulham. It's probably a pub that is best enjoyed outdoors. So let's take a look at the history of The Ship. The What Pub website suggests that it was originally founded in around the 1780s and to begin with served as an inn for the local watermen. The earliest newspaper mention I could find of a ship in Wandsworth dates to 1818, although not absolutely clear it's this location. And the earliest newspaper mention I could find which clearly identifies this location, at that time referred to as Waterside, is in 1844. It recounts the accidental death of a gypsy fortune teller. There is a suggestion here that she had been in the ship and was rather the worse for wear, and that was the cause of the accident. I like to think that she'd actually seen it coming and thought she'd just go out with a bang. In the 1860s Ordnance Survey map, you can see at that time there were two pubs very close together, so the ship had an almost immediate neighbour, and that was still present, the second pub, at the time of the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. However, eventually it appears that was demolished to make way for the gasworks nearby. Much of what was originally the gasworks along the river here at Wandsworth is now taken up by this development of riverside apartments, and I'm not entirely sure it's an improvement. Pub number 2, the Alma. Cheers from the Alma. This pub is immediately opposite Wandsworth Town railway station, and you can't miss it when you get out of the station. Let's take a look at the exterior first. It's a mid-19th century pub building, I think, with a circa 1900 ground floor frontage. 2 or possibly 3, depending on which side you're looking at, story pub. It's London stock brick, and it has a balustrade parapet. And can we call that a cupola at the corner, a sort of little turret with a dome? It's like a little lookout tower. Most eye-catching, of course, is this green faience tiling that wraps around both sides of the ground floor frontage. I counted at least 4 different shades of green here. Sorry, cars going past, people walking past, trains, construction work. It's on camera's list of historic pub interiors, but they do note that it has suffered at the hands of successive refurbishments over recent years. At least parts of the interior do seem to be given more over to dining. It also functions as a hotel still today. Perhaps most notable on the interior among those original remnants that do survive are these back painted mirrors. There is a little alcove towards the back of that main bar area just next to the staircase that has more of those back painted mirrors, and also a nice fireplace, both of those believed to be original from at least possibly that 1900 refit. Several coloured mosaic roundels dotted about the walls, and at least one side of the bar counter has some quite impressive carving, some quite sturdy brackets, the side perhaps furthest away from the road. Finally, there is a sort of restaurant area towards the back, which camera's listing says was originally a billiards room, and that has some carved freezers around it, which are quite impressive, although currently they're painted in a slightly darker colour, and I don't think they necessarily show them in their best light. So the pub was presumably named for the Battle of Alma, which took place in 1854, and that formed part of the Crimean War. It seems likely that the pub in some form was established relatively soon after that, possibly as early as 1855. There is a newspaper record in 1855 that the landlord at the time applied for a spirit licence, but then for some reason withdrew his application. Perhaps Mr. Phillips lost his nerve after seeing how many of the other applicants were refused. 20 different applications, of which 12 were refused, 3 were withdrawn, and only 5 were granted, so that's about a 25% success rate. Presumably that means that the Alma in its earliest incarnation was a beer house, pursuant to that Beer House Act of 1830 that we've encountered a few times before in these videos. A newspaper mention in 1867 states that they were granted a licence at that time. Slightly unclear exactly what type of licence that is, but I'm guessing that means a full licence. It was upgraded presumably to a full public house. It's not marked on this 1860s Ordnance Survey map, but that may attest to the fact it was still just a beer house at that time. I believe this map was surveyed in 1866. Note that there's another pub further up the road which does have a PH for public house. It's another Young's pub, and I believe it has been owned by Young's for much of its history. We are very much on their turf today. We're going to be seeing a lot of Young's pubs. So I once again went for another half of London Original. There wasn't a great selection on the bar, if I'm honest. Pub number 3, the Ram. Cheers from the Ram Inn. Once again, I'm competing with some background music. It potentially goes all the way back to the 16th century. So the Ram Brewery buildings that we see today were built in the 1880s. That was by architect Henry Stock. It's possible, therefore, that the Ram Inn was also built by Henry Stock. Fittingly, if it was indeed built by an architect called Henry Stock, it looks like London stock brick. It's a corner pub, splayed wide across that corner at what's a very busy junction in the middle of Wandsworth. There's something like a shell niche or possibly a segmental arch at the corner, and within that, or just below that, there is stucco carving of the Ram and the name of the pub, the Ram Inn. The ground floor frontage is later 1930s. Perhaps most noticeable about that frontage are this series of signs that denote all the different areas of the pub. You can see to the far left a sign saying dining room. Along most of the left side of the building, signs for the saloon. Around about the middle, including some of the left, public bar, and over to the right-hand side of the building as you're facing it, a sign for private bar. Looking inside, I would say this is in better state than I expected it to be. This pub was closed in 2006 at the time that the Young's Brewery closed, and I think it remained mostly closed and occupied up until 2019 when it was reopened under different management. This is no longer a Young's pub. It's a listed building, and Historic England notes that the ground floor retains some beamed plaster ceilings. There's also some stained glass around the outside of that main bar room. Some Young's Brewery livery still. There is a bit of glazing behind the bar with that Ram logo on it. Wood panelling most of the way around the interior. So there are claims of a pub and or possibly a brew house on this site going all the way back to 1533. And despite the Young's Brewery having moved out of here in 2006, there is still a legacy continuing of brewing on this site, and we'll get to that a bit later. So that pub in the 16th century at some point took the name the Ram Inn. The earliest mention I could find of it is in the Weekly Journal, which was also called the Saturday's Post, in 1720, so that's already pretty old. A quarter of a century later, there is a publication called the Wandsworth Campaign, a Poem, in 1746. That also mentions the Ram Inn as a pub of no menial fame. Note also the Tweed mention in that. I think the overall context of that poem is the Jacobite Rising of 1745. So Young's ceased their brewing operations here in 2006, and their branded beers are now brewed in Bedford. This was initially a joint venture between them and Charles Wells, but eventually Young's, the company, sold all of their brewing operations onto Wells. Wells then in turn sold all of their brewing operations onto Marston's, and Marston's then became part of the Carlsberg Group, and I think there is now some sort of corporate entity called, is it Carlsberg Marston's? So today Young's are purely a pub chain. They don't do any brewing themselves. As noted, this is no longer a Young's pub today. Alas, on my visit they didn't have any hand pumps on, so I've just had some keg Guinness. Pub number 4, and okay, it's not exactly a pub, but bear with me, Sambrook's Brewery Tap. Cheers from Sambrook's Brewery Tap. As I've probably said twice already, yes, this is not a pub, but it is keeping the tradition of brewing alive on this site, the former site of the Ram Brewery, that apparently may well go back to the 16th century. Sambrook's were established in Battersea, I believe it was, in 2008, as part of the first wave of 21st century independent London breweries, and they moved to this site in around 2020. Many of you will be familiar with my slight misgivings about some of the modern wave of new breweries in the UK, and I'm certainly not a fan of the term craft beer. It's sort of ill-defined. What does it actually mean? I've always been much more of a real ale man. I know exactly where I am with real ale. There is an official definition of what it is thanks to the campaign for real ale. Craft beer often ends up meaning sort of grapefruity flavoured beer that I just really can't stand. But one of the things I like about Sambrook's as a brewery is that they still make some traditional English beer styles. They have Wandle, which is a best bitter, as well as Junction, which is a premium bitter. I'm having a half of Wandle here. Now, I believe the hops for Wandle are Fuggles, Goldings, very, very safe territory, and a slightly more unusual hop called Boadicea. Boudica, is it? Named after the Celtic warrior who fought off the Romans. It's still of English origin. It comes from Wye College. Does not taste of grapefruit. I really like this stuff. You see it in pubs around London. Always a welcome sight. They also serve pizza on site, and you know, I am a human being. I do have to eat, so if you'll excuse me, I'm going to have a bit of pizza. This isn't a historic pub by any definition, but it does continue this legacy of brewing. And, you know, what better use for this space that has now been redeveloped into various different commercial units than an actual brewery. It's also quite nice on the interior of the bar here to be able to get those glimpses of the tanks. I'm not sure if they're currently in service or not, but a good reminder that you are in a brewery. And I, for one, quite appreciate this little oasis of something other than Young's beer, to be honest. In Wandsworth, Young's never having been particularly my favourite brewery. The pizza was also really good. Pub number 4, the Spread Eagle. Cheers from the Spread Eagle. This is a rather splendid late Victorian pub that sits opposite the Ram Inn where we were earlier. The current building dates to 1898 and it's predominantly in red brick with white stone dressings. Both the historic England listing for the building and CAMRA's pub heritage site refers to this exterior as Flemish Renaissance in style. There is certainly a Dutch gable, I'll give it that. I would say this is probably more Queen Anne revival style. Some of the standout motifs for that architectural style are curly gables, as you'd also see in Flemish Renaissance, red brick and white stone dressings, and the real giveaway for me are these brick panels that have sunflower motifs on them. So I think Queen Anne Revival, a far more appropriate label here. There is a nice array of pink granite pilasters on the ground floor frontage. Ruth Siddall hasn't visited here as far as I know, so we don't have a definitive identification of those. As always with pink granite, I would assume it's possibly either something Swedish and coastal or it's from Aberdeenshire, closer to home. There's a sign running along the frontage stating wholesale and retail wine and spirit merchant. Another panel of that reads dining, and further along there is one saying saloon. There's also an iron and glass porch or possibly canopy, and that gives a hint that this pub has been leaning more towards use as a hotel for much of its lifetime. Today we have primarily two main bar spaces. To the left-hand side as you enter, there is what was previously a public bar that has a curved bar counter. Probably original, possibly has been shortened at some point. There is a glazed partition between here and the larger room. On the right hand as you enter is a much larger saloon bar. That acted as a sort of lobby as well, given this pub's function as a hotel. There is a staircase leading to the rooms upstairs. Again, the bar back and the bar counter here are at least partly original with some modifications. A little bit further back in that large room is an octagonal skylight, although apparently some of the glass therein has been replaced somewhat recently, sadly. A tiled and cast iron fireplace there, and then another partition separates this space from the dining room. The dining room inside is mostly more modern today, but those partitions are quite impressive and original, and there is some inscription on one of the doors there reading dining room and lounge. You have to imagine with the interior of this pub how it may have looked when it was lit by probably gas lamps compared to the LEDs that no doubt light it today. So let's take a look at the history of the Spread Eagle. I suspect it has origins as a coaching inn. You can still get a bit of a sense of that with the archway leading through to what likely would have been something like a stable yard. So I believe the Portsmouth Road, which is roughly along the route of the A3, which runs right past the pub today, and it's part of the reason you probably can't hear me very well, it's a very busy route, likely would have been a historic coaching route. And with the earliest known mention of the Spread Eagle here at 1745, it would have existed a good century prior to the railway coming to Wandsworth. That earliest mention of 1745 is in the London Gazette, and that suggests that it would have been present even at the time of John Rock's map of 1746. The area was clearly developed, and there's a prominent looking building on the corner where the Spread Eagle stands today. According to the brewery history website, the Spread Eagle was bought by Young's in 1836 and rebuilt by them in 1898. In the year it was rebuilt, the new assembly rooms were used to host a Christmas meal for children of poor families in Wandsworth. 1,200 of them in total. I'm having a half of naked ladies from the Twickenham Brewery. I remember this being around decades ago and thought it would be relatively safe territory and not particularly grapefruity. It does have a bit of a citrus twang to it, alas. Not sure if the hops have changed over the years, but oh well. So I have nearly an hour to kill until the next pub on my itinerary for today opens, so I suppose I could go into the BrewDog here in Wandsworth. Or not. Pub number 6, the Cat's Back. Cheers from the cat's back. This is a pub that I wanted to include on today's itinerary, despite the slight difficulty that it doesn't open until 4 p.m. most weekdays, because I remember coming here something like 12 years ago, and that was on the eve of when they were being purchased by Harvey's, making this one of the 3 pubs owned by Harvey's in London. I would say the building actually looks a bit neo-Georgian to me, and I wonder if it may possibly have been rebuilt in that interwar period or possibly immediately post World War II. The style of it with that sort of hip roof, the dormer windows, the brickwork, the flat brick arches over the windows, overall looks kind of like that mid to early 20th century neo-Georgian pub style. The Harvey's signage and these very nice, I think, etched windows with Harvey's livery and a picture of the Harvey's Brewery in Lewes are modern. They date to that 2012 takeover by the brewery. It does also have some nice glazed tiles on the exterior, a nice carved wooden bench to sit out the front of the pub, as well as this little outdoor space out the back where I'm currently sitting. Inside, I think it probably has been somewhat modernised since last time I was here. Alas, I don't think I took any usable interior photos when I was here 12 years ago. Came with my friend Andy and we occupied ourselves constructing Domino Henge, a version of Stonehenge with dominoes. There's a slightly odd looking bar counter today that appears to have drawers. I think that possibly only dates to a change of management around 2021. So the name is a relatively recent one, The Cat's Back, and that dates to possibly around the 1990s when the owner at the time was refurbishing the pub. The owner's cat went missing during those refurbishments and returned, and triumphantly the owner wrote on the door that the cat was back, and that just became the new name for the pub. Prior to that, it was known as the Forester's Arms for most of its history. The Dictionary of Pub Names suggests that the Forester's Arms, it's a relatively common pub name, may derive from the ancient order of foresters, and that was a friendly society that I think later became known as the Foresters Friendly Society. It was probably a beer house originally, again relating to that Beer House Act of 1830. You can see a mention of I think it does it say beer retailer here in the census of 1871. So it's a Harvey's pub today, but it's interesting how many different breweries this pub has likely been associated with over the years. It's not marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, possibly because it was still operating as a beer house at that time. But note here the site of the Union Brewery. I wonder if this pub may originally have been the brewery tap for that brewery and then eventually parted ways with it. A newspaper mention of 1920, at which time it was still a beer house, states that it was leased to the Brandon's Putney Brewery. A 1928 advert for Mann, Crossman and Paulin Brewery lists the Forester's Arms as a place to buy their beer. I think there might be a little bit of a Australian connection with this pub today. Although they don't routinely serve food, they have kind of regular snack-based nights, and a lot of those seem to be leaning towards Australian type snack food. Of course, the main draw for me is that it's a Harvey's pub, and this Harvey's Sussex Best is in very good form. That is it for today from here in Wandsworth. It does seem to be a little bit of a you can't have your cake and eat it sort of a place in terms of pubs. We went to 2 pubs that had fantastic beer, I thought, but perhaps not particularly exciting interiors, and 2 pubs that had great interiors but not particularly exciting beer. Anyway, if you happen to be in this neck of the woods, hopefully some food for thought there. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.